Well, welcome to the Period 5 review, the one involving the 4 SAQs. You may have written 3 of them last night since you had paper for 3. There were 4, so it would still be a good idea if you at least looked at and tried to come up with an answer for the one that you did not write on between questions 3 and 4. So today, the activity that I'm going to have you do is going to be similar to what we did yesterday, where you're going to partner up and talk about your answers with somebody in just a few minutes, and then come back together as a whole class and look at potential answers, and then partner up again, and then come back as a whole class. And each time you'll just have me there just via the magic of video. So let's begin with our first partnering up. Take 3 minutes and discuss your answers for question 1 with your partner. Go. Our first SAQ deals with dueling historians, and the same will be true for your AP exam itself. This time it's Eric Foner against Michael F. Holt. Both of them writing about the politics of slavery and the coming of the Civil War, but from different perspectives. For Eric Foner, if you'll pay attention to the area shaded in the middle in yellow, where he talks about the stigma attached to slave societies, which Republicans use as their reason why they don't support slavery. They're the party of free labor, and they think slavery degrades labor. It does, as Foner says here, allow them to sidestep the question of race. They're actually mostly racists, and instead argue that the North is a free labor society, its values are free, and the South is the antithesis of this egalitarian vision of free labor. Michael Holt says, slavery is just really a trumped up political debate between politicians trying to steal votes. Really, there's no public pressure, he says, for or against slavery or territorial expansion. It's just all politicians. They're just trying to drum up what they think is important. So let's look at some answers. For the dueling historians, for A, Foner's argument is that anti-slavery in the North is rooted in the belief that slavery hurts white equality. They have a free labor society. Slavery is a direct threat to their free labor Northern society. Holt argues, on the other hand, that slavery is pushed by politicians on both sides to stir up debate. It's not rooted in any real differences. It's simply rooted in the desire of politicians to gain votes. For B, an answer that you could have put was that Northerners believed in the slave power thesis, the idea that Southerners had systematically gained so much control of the federal government that they were able to control any attempts at getting rid of slavery, which proves Foner's point that slavery threatens the privileges of white Northern males. In C, I think the easiest one to go to is the Brooks-Sumner affair, which 2 politicians engaged in a fight on the floor of the Senate. The Southern one actually attacked the Northern one. And that does kind of back up Holt's claim that what we really have here are politicians fighting over these issues, and that the people aren't really interested or invested in these issues. It's really just a politician's game. Other possible evidence for B and C. If you wanted to support Foner with the Free Soil Party and the Republican Party, which are both sectional, and argued that the West needs to remain open for white settlement to preserve white equality, I think that would work well. For Holt, I would probably pick the Lincoln-Douglas debates, because it's 2 politicians arguing in order to win an election. And so they're arguing over this abstract concept about slavery, and people are cheering them on, not because they really care, but because it's a political fight. One thing I would caution you to think about, or encourage you to think about, is that arguing against a historian is often harder, because in your head, you have to imagine the opposite argument that the historian is posing. You have to be able to flip that argument around, or be aware of another argument that a historian could be posing about the issues here, which is the coming of the Civil War. And that is quite difficult to do. So in some ways, arguing against can be difficult unless you know of a specific counterexample that's right on the tip of your tongue that you can pull on out to write about. So I think sometimes if you're given a choice between supports and argues against, supports is probably the easiest, since you have the argument in front of you and you can think of evidence that supports that argument that's right there in front of you. Our second SAQ is always going to be some kind of primary source analysis. In this case, it's visual. I have a feeling it'll probably be visual for your exam as well. This you should see from the face of it that it's about foreign labor, Catholicism, the corrupted morals of the youth. So it's a nativist publication from the 1850s, the American patriot, right? America first kind of idea that Americans are under attack by all of these foreigners who threaten all of our institutions. This time, find a partner who is different from the first person that you talked with today and discuss your answers to question number 2. So in answer for part A of number 2, I would talk about urban areas of the North swelling in size because these migrants fleeing the political situations in Europe, the revolutions of 1848, or poor economies in the case of the Irish, and they settle in northern cities where they're accused of stealing elections by illegal voting activities. And almost always they end up in the Democratic Party. So if you wanted to do A and talk about urban issues, that's where I would go with that. If you wanted to talk about cultural unrest, you could talk about the immigrants' Catholicism or their drinking cultures, which Northerners rejected because they said, you know, the good, solid people of the North are Protestant and they don't drink. And so these migrants are a threat to the morals of Northerners. And then finally, if you wanted to take the labor part of that prompt, you could focus on how immigrants are accused of being cheap laborers who lower the value of labor and take jobs away from Americans. So it's another, they took our jobs kind of thing. 2B. I would go with the Know Nothing Party as a response. I think it's a perfect fit here, and it should be something you should know. You should know something about the Know Nothings. And their platform was ending foreign influence in politics, keeping elections pure from, you know, corrupting foreign influence. You could also be more generic and talk about the uptick in temperance reform to counteract these dangerous drunken migrants. So, for example, you could talk about the Maine laws or the Massachusetts liquor laws. You could talk about Washingtonian temperance societies reaching out to working class folks as examples of temperance reform addressing the threat brought by immigrants. More obscure and probably something you don't remember from your reading, but maybe you do. Northerners also engaged in quite a bit of violence against these migrants because of their Catholicism. So there were attacks on Catholic schools. A Catholic convent was burned down. And in Philadelphia, there were actually Bible riots over Catholic education versus Protestant education. 2C asks you to look to another era in time. And my thinking immediately was the Emergency Quota Acts of 1921-24, which was to deal with the threat of Southern and Eastern migrants taking our jobs and ruining American culture and being radical anarchists. Another good comparison about the fear of migrants would be the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was passed to keep the Chinese from competing with American labor. But it's also based in, of course, racism against the Chinese and perceptions of them as inferior to Americans. So both of these would be good to go. Just remember to keep it specific. The next one, 3, is a turning point. exercise. And when you think about turning points, whether it's an essay or an SAQ, imagine the event having a before and an after, and what's different after versus before. And that should help you assess if something really is a turning point, if it makes a real difference in American lives in this case. So in this case, you are looking at the coming of the Civil War and what's a turning point that makes American life different in the lead up to the Civil War. If you did question number 3, it would be a good idea to partner up with someone who didn't do question number 3, so that the two of you could talk through it and you could essentially share your ideas for how you answered it with them. And try to see if you can work with somebody who's different from the first 2 people that you worked with, just so you make it around the room and get a wide variety of opinions. Go. For 3A, I think the easiest one to argue is the Compromise of 1850 because it has the Fugitive Slave Act. That turns Northerners into slave catchers under the authority of the federal government. This causes Northerners to consider for the first time in their lives, wait, I have to be a slave catcher. Oh wow, slavery really affects me as a person. It's not just an abstract threat to my way of life. And so many more of them are drawn into anti-slavery positions in the Free Soil movement, in the coming Republican movement. You could argue Dred Scott because it argues that property can be taken anywhere in the United States. You can't deprive people of their rights to property under the Fifth Amendment. So Northerners are worried about the potential of slavery becoming a nationwide phenomenon. I would say Lincoln's election is actually the weakest. It triggers the Civil War, but it's actually the result of a whole long decade of building up of tensions. For this question, I would go with the election of Lincoln as one of the weakest turning points, since Lincoln's election is the triggering point for the war itself, but it depends on a decade's worth of controversy leading up to it. So you don't really understand or get to Lincoln without a whole decade of fights over slavery in the West, the formation of the Republican Party, and all those issues pour into Lincoln so that he becomes the emblem of a whole decade of agitation over this issue. And that agitation convinces Southerners that they cannot trust Northerners. So it doesn't even matter who wins the election. It's the fact that this guy, this Republican in power, cannot be trusted to be safe on the issue of slavery. So I see it less of a turning point than more of like an immediate trigger for the war itself. For 3C, I would go with the birth of the immediate emancipation movement. And you could either talk about it that way as an event, or you could mention William Lloyd Garrison and the founding of the Liberator as a specific illustration of that in the early 1830s. Without this immediate emancipation movement, you don't really get to the idea of slavery being a national sin that needs to be eliminated from the American body politic. So it's hard to get to the Civil War without these abolitionists who are constantly raising this issue of the immorality of slavery. Even though there's a minority of them, there are only about 10,000 Northerners, their voices are strong and they dominate public discussion in a very significant way, even forcing Southerners to come to the defense of slavery with a positive good thesis. So I would argue that they're really important for a turning point. Now, you could have picked other turning points that are not mentioned in the list, such as the Mexican-American War with the Wilmot Proviso. Maybe you wanted to pick Dred Scott, closer to the war itself. The birth of the Republican Party is a good one. Whatever you pick, you just have to be able to defend it as a good turning point, that it changes the nature of the game in a way that is significant from what was happening before. Our last SAQ about African Americans during Reconstruction will ask you to think about the positive and negative effects of Reconstruction for a particular minority group, and through the lens of social, legal, and economic developments. And finally, you guessed it, I'm going to ask you to pair up with a different person for the fourth time. And ideally, you'd find someone who didn't answer question 4 so they could learn from your process of answering it how you would have approached those questions. So go ahead and share your thoughts for the last question. In answering 4A, I would go with education as a social development. Since Southerners were never going to accept the equality of African Americans, and in some cases still don't, the best that African Americans could really expect in the aftermath of the Civil War was the access to learn how to read and write through freedom schools that were established to teach them these fundamental skills. And that opens up a world for them that they were denied previously. The ability to read the scriptures for themselves, to engage in politics, to engage in just reading for pleasure, being able to sign their names to contracts and deeds is a really big social change that elevates them from property to people in the same way that they would like to have been before the war, but were denied by the institution of slavery itself. For 4B, I would go with the 15th Amendment, but the 13th or the 14th would also work. The 15th Amendment grants the right to vote to African American males, so it does exclude women, but that's a legal and powerful right for African Americans to participate in the political system. So they can hold elected offices, they can vote for people running for those offices, and that gives them political power, even though we might admit that that power is circumscribed by the KKK and the eventual redemption of Southern states by the Democrats at the end of Reconstruction. For 4C, you could see that I was heading towards sharecropping here, since it's the most common example of the economic institution that holds African Americans back, keeping them from achieving prosperity, and therefore they can't exercise their other rights because they don't have the money to do so. I think you could also use the convict lease system, in which African Americans were criminalized for certain behaviors like not having proof of a job or residency, sent to jail, and then when they couldn't pay their fines and their fees, they would be sold to the highest bidder, who would use them to construct roads and railroads. Andrew Carnegie even hired them for steel production facilities in the South. So essentially this recreates slavery in everything but the name. It's a legalized form of slavery. So that really also hurts African American economic prospects as well.